Good morning. I have a reading this morning of kind of a follow-up to an OPB presentation in December about Oregon's moon country and its suitability for training astronauts for the Apollo 2 mission. On July 69, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin landed on the surface of the moon. In the months leading up to their expeditions, the Apollo 2 astronauts trained in a remote moon-like desert in southeastern Oregon. The area is home to several Native American communities, and there's a story or legend, depending on the encounter, describing the encounter between the astronauts and one of the locals. One day as they were training, the astronaut came across an old Native American. The man asked them what they were doing there. They replied that they were part of a research expedition that would shortly travel to the moon and explore the moon. When the old man heard that, he turned away for a moment and asked then if they could please do him a favor. "What do you want?" the astronauts asked. "Well," said the old man, "my tribe and the moon spirits are one and the same, and I have a message that I'd like you to take to them for us from the people of Earth." "What's the message?" the astronauts asked. Well, the old man said it's a very sacred message and can only be uttered in our language. He told these astronauts what the message was, made them carefully remember it. They asked the astronauts to repeat it again and again until they memorized it correctly. "What does it mean?" asked the astronauts. "Oh, I cannot tell you. It's a secret that only the tribe and the moon spirits are allowed to know." When they returned to the base, the astronauts searched and searched until they found someone who knew the language and could interpret it for them. When they repeated what they had memorized, the translator started to laugh, and when he calmed down, the astronauts asked him, what did it mean? The man explained that the sentence that they spent so much time memorizing was, "Don't believe a single word these people are telling you. They've come to steal your land."
Jeff Seward's clear, insightful, and at times frighteningly prescient take on politics has made him one of our most sought-after speakers at HGP. Dr. Seward teaches and writes on politics and government at Pacific University. Growing up in an Air Force family, he lived in Germany for 3 years and in 6 different states in the U.S. He then began his career studying politics and became a legislative reporter and award-winning documentary film producer for public television, interviewing such figures as William F. Buckley Jr., Edward Teller, Barry Commoner, and more. Moving to an academic career, Jeff earned 2 more political science degrees, the latter at Stanford University, where work on his doctoral dissertation sent him to Brazil for 3 years of field work. He specializes in comparative politics, especially in Latin America. Jeff's book, The Politics of Capitalist Transformation, Brazilian Informatics Policy, Regime Change, and State Autonomy, was published by Routledge in 2018. In addition to his explaining what informatics means, I'm looking forward to hearing his insights on competitive authoritarianism and whether that is the next bad news for progressives in the U.S. A warm hand, please, for Professor Jeff Seward.
The title of my talk today is the U.S. Becoming a Competitive Authoritarian Regime? When I proposed that last fall, my intent was to offer something very provocative that you might not have thought of before. Now it sort of seems like I'm just summarizing the day's news. I don't think I'd have much trouble convincing this crowd that we're moving in an authoritarian direction. What I do want to do, though, is to try to acquaint you with some recent theorizing in comparative politics, my specialty, to give a little more concrete specificity to the authoritarian threat that I think we face. But first, I wanted to offer you some bad news and some good news and then some more bad news based on recent election polling. But that data in recent days forces me to offer you some bad news and then some more bad news instead. The first bad news is that the most recent Gallup poll that came out this past week shows that despite months of negative news around the impeachment process, Donald Trump now has an approval rating of 49% of the American public, the highest that he has ever registered in the Gallup poll. This is especially significant because if you look at all the major polling organizations, Gallup has tended to have Trump's approval ratings on the low end, in the low 40s and sometimes even in the high 30s. For Gallup to suddenly register an approval rating of 49% is really disturbing. In some ways, even more disturbing, the Gallup poll showed a sharp increase in approval of the Republican Party and a significant drop in the approval rating of the Democratic Party. Back in September, the Democrats had a favorable rating of 48, and the Republicans a rating of 43, a 5-point advantage for the Democrats, 48 to 43. Now the Republicans have gained 8 points, and the Democrats have lost 5 points. So it is now 51% approval for the Republican Party and 43% approval for the Democratic Party. So while the Democrats led by 5 points in September, they now trail by 8 points. And this shift has happened, as you all know, during a time when the mainstream press, both print and broadcast, has been just hammering the Republican Party and Trump for being cowardly partisans, completely unwilling to criticize President Trump, no matter how outrageous or illegal his behavior has been. That's the bad news. My good news was going to be that I thought the Gallup poll was an outlier. The Rasmussen poll, which does not rely on live interviews and has a bad reputation among pollsters, and which has often had Trump's approval ratings at 50% or higher, even when Gallup was showing 41 or 42%, the Rasmussen poll last week had Trump at only 48% approval, actually below the Gallup poll. So I thought there was a good chance that Gallup just had come up with a bad sample this week. You know, it happens to the best of pollsters. I wasn't going to believe it until I found other polls saying something similar. Unfortunately, yesterday, another respectable poll, the Harvard-Harris poll, also had Trump at 49% approval, suggesting that the Gallup poll was not an outlier, but rather a harbinger of things to come. So instead of bad news and good news, I'm afraid I just have bad news and bad news. Then the other bad news I was going to highlight is that even if both the Gallup and Harvard-Harris polls were outliers, looking at all the presidential approval polls, it is undeniable that during this whole impeachment process, this whole saga, while Trump was just getting blasted every day by print and broadcast media and by a host of non-Trumpian conservative commentators, his approval ratings have suffered not at all and may even have improved. Even worse, the number of people who strongly approve of Trump went up 5 points, while the number of persons who strongly disapprove of Trump went down 8 points. So this whole season of impeachment has mobilized Trump supporters and demobilized his opponents. Meanwhile, the Democratic Party, as you may have noticed, is floundering, trying to come up with a consensus presidential candidate capable of uniting the party and defeating Trump in the fall, or leading the Democrats to retaking a majority in the U.S. Senate. In my opinion, there's a very good chance that Trump will be elected again in the Electoral College despite losing the popular vote. Hillary Clinton won 3 million votes more than Trump and lost. One analysis by NBC News recently suggested that he could possibly win a majority of the Electoral College in 2020, even while losing the popular vote by 5 million votes. Now, while all that seems to me very bad news, for those of you out there who are Trump supporters. It may sound good, but to the rest of us, it seems like very bad news. In one sense, it's not particularly authoritarian. That's how American democracy and the American Constitution works. We've had a number of elections in which the winner of the popular vote lost the election without that by itself leading us to feel that American democracy was in danger. Popular sentiment may be shifting toward Trump. We have an election, and he and his party win. On one level, that's just business as usual. Just business that I don't like because I'm an anti-Trump partisan and I'll be on the losing end of it. But I don't think we are experiencing anything like business as usual in American democracy. I believe, in fact, that American democracy is in very serious danger of collapsing into an emerging form of authoritarianism that would preserve many of the trappings of representative constitutional democracy, but with the core reality of democracy all but eliminated. If Trump is reelected and Republicans retain the Senate and chip into the Democratic majority in the House, I think not just that a progressive agenda will be thwarted, I believe American democracy itself will be in serious danger. This non-democracy would not resemble Nazi Germany or Mussolini's fascist Italy or the Soviet Union or a repressive military dictatorship. Instead, political scientists in recent decades have identified a new form of non-democratic rule in the world, and they've come up with a new name for it as well: competitive authoritarianism. This concept emerged out of a literature that was trying to understand democratic transitions. There were all these new democracies emerging around. Former military dictatorships, especially in Latin America, or former communist systems seemed on the road to constructing authentic democracies. They let exiled dissidents come home. They ended press censorship, permitted the formation of political parties and an assortment of interest groups, dismantled the secret police, and held competitive elections. Political scientists kept themselves busy for a couple of decades trying to explain why democratic transitions were occurring and how to tell when these embryonic democracies had consolidated themselves. And then something unexpected started happening. A lot of these new democracies, instead of consolidating their democratic features, began to backslide and move back in an authoritarian direction. At the same time, they didn't go all the way back and recreate communist or military dictatorships. They still permitted multiple political parties. They still had multi-party elections. An opposition press and political activists, while harassed, were still permitted to dissent, etc. But it felt increasingly wrong to call these places democratic. The ruling party or the ruling leader kept winning elections, but the playing field for those elections kept getting tilted more and more, so that the likelihood of an opposition party getting a victory not only seemed unlikely due to the popularity of the incumbents, but increasingly impossible, because every year more obstacles were put in the way of opposition groups mounting an effective challenge to those ruling elites' power. This happened in Russia under Putin, in Turkey under Erdogan, in Venezuela under Chavez, and even more so under Maduro, and increasingly in even European Union countries such as Hungary under Orban or Poland under the Law and Justice Party. The ruling leader or ruling party kept winning elections, but it was harder and harder to call those elections democratic. At first, political scientists tried to think of these new regimes as unstable transitional arrangements. Inevitably, they would either return to traditional dictatorships or muddle through and become authentic democracies. But as they have persisted, more and more political scientists see them as more or less stable configurations, a more or less permanent new form of regime, ones that pay token respect for the general concept of democracy, while actually gutting their political systems of most of what is required for authentic democratic competition. Hence the term competitive authoritarianism. They still sort of look like democracies if you don't look very closely, but if you do look very closely, you're hard put to say, well, yeah, that's a democratic system. What's the essential character of this new form of regime, of competitive authoritarianism? Well, the people who more or less invented the term, two political scientists named Levitsky and Way, put it this way. In competitive authoritarian regimes, formal democratic institutions are widely viewed as the principal means of obtaining and exercising political authority. However, incumbents violate those rules so often and to such an extent that the regime fails to meet conventional minimum standards for democracy. More specifically, in competitive authoritarianism, the ruler or ruling party gradually and systematically chips away at the independence of all the institutions that should limit their authority. Four institutions in particular are critical. First, the electoral arena. Although still competitive, and opponents still sometimes win bits and pieces of power, the playing field is increasingly tilted through gerrymandering, voter suppression, intimidation of political opponents, limitation of opponent access to the media, etc. In the judicial arena, courts are politicized and their independence undermined by the ruling party or leader, so that they are only rarely available to check executive authority that challenges legal limits or democratic norms. Third, the legislative arena. Legislatures are so thoroughly controlled by the ruling party that they are unwilling or unable to check or limit the authority of the executive. And finally, the media arena. While opposition media still exist, some opposition media is shut down or disappears. The ruling party directly or indirectly buys up opposition media and replaces it with pro-government propaganda outlets, etc. The overall effect is that vigorous opposition still exists, but its chances of victory in elections or over major policies becomes minimal, because the playing field has been so systematically tilted in favor of the ruling party that the competition is no longer even close to fair and therefore no longer really democratic. How well does this fit emerging patterns in the US? You may have noticed some things even before I mentioned anything here. Well, first, the electoral arena. Well, first of all, we have some major anti-democratic features of our electoral arena already built into our Constitution. Neither Trump nor the Republican Party created the Electoral College or the U.S. Senate, but both are constructed in a way that now significantly tilts our democratic elections in their favor. And as we shift demographically away from rural areas to major urban centers, this tilt in favor of conservative Republicans becomes ever more pronounced. To bring this home, just how undemocratic these are, imagine the following scenario. Imagine our institutions of the U.S. Senate and electing presidents were more straightforwardly democratic. Imagine we had an electoral system for Congress that was fully based on population. The House would be elected as it is now in 2-year terms in equal-sized districts, and the senators would have 6-year terms to give them more independence and be elected statewide to give them a broader view of things, but with each state getting a number of senators in proportion to their population. So the 10 smallest states get 1 senator each. Rhode Island, Montana, Delaware, South Dakota, North Dakota, Alaska, District of Columbia, Vermont, and Wyoming. 1 each. California gets 39 senators. Texas gets 27, Florida gets 20, New York gets 19. So the Senate represents the population proportionately. And we elect our president by popular vote with a runoff of the top 2 candidates if no one gets to 50%, which is how most countries run their presidential elections. And then we've got this system, and someone comes along and proposes that we change it and have a Senate in which Wyoming's 500,000 people get the same representation in the Senate as California's 39 million people. And we create an electoral college that gives every state the number of votes that it has representatives, plus those 2 senators now that each state has. What chance would that have of passing? A radically undemocratic shift of institutions. Everyone would be appalled. They're saying, how could you possibly propose such a change? The Supreme Court in the early 1960s ruled this sort of Senate representation at the state level unconstitutional. States back then were mimicking the national constitution and letting each county elect an equal number of senators, so that counties with 20 or 30 times the population of smaller counties were getting the same state Senate representation as those smaller counties. The court says that's obviously undemocratic, it's unconstitutional, and decreed 1 person, 1 vote. They couldn't do that at the national level because this thing at the national level was written into the Constitution. You couldn't declare the Senate unconstitutional when it was established by the Constitution. So both the Senate and the Electoral College already tilt the playing field in dramatic ways. And the tilt gets worse every year as our population shifts from rural areas to urban areas. This isn't a result of any current contemporary conspiracy to distort our democracy. It's a distortion we created in the beginning that just happens to have gotten worse. And we created it largely as a concession to slaveholding states who otherwise would have been hopelessly outnumbered in the Senate by more populous, non-slave northern states. So the Republican Party starts off with a major and growing advantage through a pre-existing tilt in our constitutional electoral arrangements. Now add to this shameless gerrymandering to allow the Republicans to control the House, gerrymandering, not currently, but up until recently, gerrymandering that several courts have determined were directly and explicitly designed to reduce the electoral power of minority voters and other voters like college students that seemed likely to support Democrats. And shameless multi-pronged efforts to suppress the vote of these same groups by purging voter rolls, implementing voter ID laws, intimidating voter registration movements, manipulating election rules to make it harder to vote in minority neighborhoods, etc., etc., etc. There's a long list of those. With all of this, Democrats have to win the presidential elections, not by a majority, but by millions of votes. 3 million in 2016 wasn't enough. More than 5 million extra may not be enough in 2020. Democrats have to outvote Republicans by 6 or 7% in order to win a majority in the House of in the House of Representatives. And Democrats have to defeat multiple Republican candidates in medium and small states to get control of the Senate, even though Democrats regularly win a clear majority of votes cast for senators. And this same sort of thing is happening at the state level with state legislatures where Republicans control those bodies. This week, the Justice Department, I don't know if you mentioned this, and I'm amazed that it hasn't gotten more critical commentary. The Justice Department announced that any investigation of a presidential candidate in the 2020 election must be approved by the Attorney General. To me, that means that if Trump engages in a corrupt scheme to affect the 2020 election and the FBI wants to open an investigation, it will be vetoed by our highly partisan pro-Trump Attorney General, William Barr, who is still trying to investigate and discredit the Mueller investigation. On the other hand, if some set of agents in the FBI decide it is sensible to launch an investigation of the Democratic candidate, they will certainly get a green light from Barr. Also this week, the Treasury Department, under another pro-Trump partisan, Stephen Mnuchin, agreed to turn over to a Republican Senate committee confidential financial material about Hunter Biden, after previously refusing to turn over any of President Trump's financial information or tax data to House committees on the grounds that they had no legitimate legislative purpose in requesting them. But of course, they've got a legitimate legislative purpose for Hunter Biden's records. That effort to get Trump's information is now in the courts, endlessly in the courts. Are our elections now and in the future really going to be democratic? Or are they going to be subject to the manipulation of the Treasury Department, the Attorney General, and these multiple efforts to further tilt the electoral playing field? The judicial arena. What about the courts? Well, conservatives have used their growing control of the courts to chip away at protections for democratic elections. They've effectively abolished the role of the American Bar Association, a nonpartisan group representing the whole legal profession, in vetting the qualifications of judicial appointments, and replaced it with the highly partisan, highly ideological Federalist Society as the primary vetting organization for judicial appointments. The Federalist Society, in effect, is nominating all the judicial nominees to the president, who then picks from that selection to nominate them to the Congress. As a result, they have flooded the federal judiciary with highly partisan, highly ideological, sometimes overtly racist and or homophobic conservative judges, many of them deemed unqualified by the American Bar Association. They, of course, also blocked President Obama's constitutional authority to appoint a Supreme Court justice and refused to even meet with his moderate centrist nominee, Merrick Garland. In effect, they stole the Supreme Court's seat. The Roberts Court, with its increasingly conservative majority, has gutted the Voting Rights Act, and that then empowered states to enact a whole series of voter suppression laws. And Texas and Florida, I think it was Florida, started the very next day after that decision to impose voter suppression laws. It has also, through Citizens United and assorted other decisions, made it virtually impossible to enact any meaningful campaign finance law reforms without passing an almost impossible constitutional amendment. It has also overruled lower courts that found extreme gerrymandering unconstitutional and declared that gerrymandering is an issue that courts are incompetent to address. It is likely also to overrule lower courts in their rejection of voter ID laws and other voter suppression laws and regulations at the state level. So this politicization of the courts has exacerbated the distortions in the electoral arena and heavily tilted the electoral arena, already distorted by the Electoral College and the Senate, even further in the direction of favoring the Republican Party. Yet to come are further Supreme Court decisions that might ratify President Trump's exaggerated claims of executive authority and gut the authority of the Congress to oversee the executive branch or even subpoena witnesses or documents of the executive branch. Conservative concerns about the growth of executive power under Obama are turning into a celebration of the Trump imperial presidency, and the impeachment acquittal is a major but not the only piece of that process. And if Trump is reelected, he's likely to be able to appoint 2 more highly partisan Supreme Court justices to replace Stephen Breyer and Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and several hundred more highly partisan federal judges, none of whom can be blocked by a minority Democratic Party filibuster, because the filibuster has been essentially eliminated for judicial appointments. Well, what about the legislative arena? The recent impeachment process has established a couple of realities. One, as long as the Republicans have a majority in the Senate, no Republican president need fear being convicted of high crimes and misdemeanors, no matter how egregious his behavior. This is actually not new. Mitt Romney, turns out, is the first senator in all of the impeachment cases who ever voted to convict a president of his own party. So the impeachment process was never a very robust check on executive authority, but now it seems to be completely worthless. They have also ratified the doctrine that even in an impeachment process, let alone routine oversight of the executive branch, congressional committees should have no expectation whatsoever of having a Republican administration respect any subpoena of any sort for witnesses or documents, except by going through long and uncertain court cases in courts that are increasingly dominated by highly partisan, highly ideological Federalist Society judges unlikely to be sympathetic to that subpoena power. This effectively guts congressional oversight of the executive, at least congressional oversight by the opposing party. Well, how about the media arena? Trump has prepared the ground for an aggressive campaign against print and broadcast media by going way beyond any previous president in his political attacks. He has mounted an unrelenting campaign to label all critical news coming out of highly professional journalistic or academic sources as fake news, and the professional press as a whole enemies of the people. Critical media has not been censored or shut down, as has happened in other competitive authoritarian regimes, but this demonization of the media has stripped it of its ability to influence public opinion with any facts that don't fit Trump's narrative. Witness his rising approval ratings as the mainstream press has just been blasting him for months over the Ukraine scandal and the Republicans over their unwillingness to challenge him. And his narrative is blasted out every day through his tweet storms that just repeat over and over and over the same propaganda lies. And I don't think this is an exaggeration, in imitation of Hitler's doctrine of single-minded repetition of lies that will overcome any contrary presentation of facts. Propaganda lies like no collusion, no obstruction, a perfect call, the Russia hoax, etc. There's also been a move to consolidate much of radio broadcasting and local television broadcasting and even local newspapers in the hands of highly conservative corporate conglomerates such as Clear Channel Communications, that's now iHeartMedia, which sponsors right-wing talk radio on hundreds of local stations and even sometimes dictates editorials to be read by local newscasters on their TV stations. While there are no state-owned broadcast facilities directly spouting pro-Trump propaganda, Fox News and talk radio are in effect playing that role. The overall effect is that Trump is able to lie pathologically all day, every day. Over 15,000 lies now is the count since his inauguration, and to do so with impunity because his supporters and potential supporters have been trained to ignore professional media outlets and believe uncritically unprofessional, highly partisan, highly ideological radio and TV programs. The functional effect is a slightly more moderate version of what rulers like Putin, Erdogan, and Maduro have achieved with more direct, aggressive assaults on independent media. In fact, Trump's media operations may be more effective because they are generated by institutions that are not seen as directly controlled by him. They have the facade of independent sources of information. So that's the four arenas. And we can see how developments here are moving in the direction of those who have analyzed these competitive authoritarian regimes. Because none of these phenomena individually seem like a hammer blow that undermines democracy, we tend to experience them as individual outrages that just nibble around the edges of a fundamentally democratic America, that the core of American institutions remains fundamentally and deeply democratic. Taken all together, however, they closely resemble, at least in their trajectory, the way in which competitive authoritarian regimes have installed themselves elsewhere in the world. We imagine that authoritarian rulers like Putin and Erdogan and Chavez and Maduro and Orban succeeded because their countries had weak democratic institutions compared to the robust guardrails that American democracy has erected against tyranny, both in the Constitution and in our history. But every one of those American guardrails is being dismantled, as I've tried to show. And for me, I worry that they will not be able to survive a second Trump administration. These other authoritarian leaders were also swept in by pretty strong majority votes. They were popular and won more or less democratic elections by big margins. They then used that popularity to attack every institution that restrained their power. Trump, on the other hand, has only minority support. That may be mildly comforting, but it is important to remember that in the last democratic elections in Germany's Weimar Republic, the Nazis won only 37% and 33% of the vote. Their support actually declined in the last pre-Nazi election. In Italy, Mussolini was appointed prime minister when his fascist party had only 10% of the seats in the Italian parliament. While most of the new competitive authoritarian systems have been dominated by parties or leaders with strong majority support, there are ominous historical precedents for authoritarian regimes emerging from political minorities. I see no reason to be complacent about America's democratic future. No reason to assume that America's democratic institutions will automatically survive a prolonged authoritarian assault. And a prolonged authoritarian assault is exactly what is taking place at the hands of Donald Trump and his now ultra-loyal Republican Party. I'll reserve to some future lecture, if you would ever invite me back, suggestions about what might be done to slow down this juggernaut. My primary suggestion would be that the Democratic Party get its act together and unite around a strong candidate who understands that more than any policy agenda of the right, the center, or the left, the overwhelmingly urgent political task of the moment is to defeat Donald Trump and to retake a majority in the United States Senate. All other considerations, in my view, should be subordinated to that goal. Failing that, my final suggestion to you all is to move to Uruguay. And when you do, please persuade my wife to go with you so that I can go too.
In relation to your final comments about ultimately we need to defeat Donald Trump, what are your thoughts about the Lincoln Project, and any thoughts about can it be successful or not?
I'm not familiar with the Lincoln Project.
It's a movement by Republicans opposed to Trump and trying to get him defeated. So you're not familiar with it at all?
Well, I'm familiar with this group that Kellyanne Conway's husband and others are doing called, I don't know, Republicans for the Rule of Law or something like that. I think that's a worthy cause. But, you know, what's interesting is I would say almost the great majority of conservative opinion leaders who are not elected officials have been vigorously anti-Trump since before he was elected. And they're constantly writing stuff, they're constantly on TV, and those long, loyal Republican conservative commentators seem to have had essentially zero impact on public opinion. And I think the only way that the Republican Party will begin to come to its senses is by suffering catastrophic electoral defeats. And if that happens, they'll say, oh, well, that doesn't work. The terrifying thing is that the more extreme the Republican Party has gotten, the more subservient it has gotten to Trump, the more successful it has been. And so I don't think we can put too much hope in Republicans, even conservative Republicans, somehow turning this around. They just have to suffer catastrophic defeats. What has to happen to them is what happened to the Democratic Party when McGovern lost. What's happening to the Labour Party in England right now when Corbyn lost. They need to lose the Senate, have Trump swept out of office, and say, oh, wow, well, that worked for a long time. We rode that fine, but I guess that's over. That's essentially what happened to the Republican Party with McCarthyism. They rode McCarthy. The whole Republican Party was on board with McCarthyism for years. And then McCarthy finally disgraced himself, got censured and so forth, and the Republican Party moved on to other boogeymen.
I'm curious. It seems to me that this wave of competitive authoritarianism or frank authoritarianism or whatever is going across the world.
Yes.
And I was interested in your idea of why it's happening now across the world. And I don't know how much we're going to be able to get out of line, but I'm just curious.
I think it's fundamentally due to a collapse of public confidence in mainstream established institutions. Because they aren't delivering much anymore. You know, I was talking to a student of mine 6 months or so ago, and this sort of occurred to me as I was talking to her, that for my generation, American democracy, my generation and maybe my parents' generation, American democracy delivered overcoming the Great Depression, winning World War II, winning the Cold War, ending segregation, supporting a broad set of civil rights laws, fostering the women's movement and the gay rights movement, etc., the environmental movement, passing major environmental legislation. And I said, what has American democracy delivered in the last 25 years to people who were born in 1987? And aside from some major progress in the area of gay rights, I would say basically nothing. So, and it's not just here, it's around the world. We have stagnant, paralyzed political systems that are no longer meeting any of the challenges that these societies face. We also have a globalization that has exacerbated inequality around the world, and especially has left rural areas and small towns and industrial workers behind. They have not participated in the prosperity that globalization has generated. And those people, many of whom used to be reliable voters for the left, are now saying, well, you haven't delivered anything. So I'm looking to somebody who says they're going to blow up the system and do something better. And sometimes that's on the left, more often it's on the right. But this collapse of confidence in central institutions to deliver the goods, I think has opened the door for personalistic politics that, this great man is going to somehow fix these problems because the regular institutions can't do it, and they can come to power through demagogic assaults on all those traditional institutions.
Yeah, I enjoyed your, well, I didn't say enjoy it, but respect your comment about Hitler's rise. And I think that Germany just had a major crash in their political system. Are you aware of anything like that?
Well, they just had a state election in Thuringia, and the leading party was the Liberal Party, the Free Democrats. And they couldn't get a majority to have a government. So they put the vote to the legislature, and lo and behold, the AFP, the right-wing neo-Nazi group, supported this guy's formation of a new government. And he accepted that, and the country was appalled. It was the first time that one of the major parties had accepted an implicit coalition with this far-right party, and it created a big scandal, and was denounced roundly, and yesterday, I believe it was, this guy resigned, said we're going to have new elections instead. But there's also the crisis. Germany, like all over Europe, social democratic parties have collapsed. The Socialist Party of France is almost non-existent today. The Social Democratic Party in Germany is in terrible condition. The Labour Party of Great Britain is in terrible crisis. The Conservative parties are only doing a little bit better. But it's hard to point to any established party that has been getting stronger. And it's very difficult to point to any new parties that have emerged that are strong, except demagogic populist parties of the right or the left. So you're seeing this collapse of political parties that have been the bastion of democratic processes. And I don't really see that trend reversing itself. And I'm not quite sure what the alternative to that is either.
I agree that the prime concern should be to defeat Trump, but how to do it? It seems that the more we bash Trump, he seems to be gaining more. So what should be the tactic? What should be adopted?
Beats me.
You got somebody.
I was riding the Joe Biden horse, but he seems to be sway-backed and in need of a couple of new horseshoes. I don't know that he's going to get there. I think Bernie Sanders would be the absolutely worst candidate. I think he would lose to Trump overwhelmingly. I don't think a gay small-town mayor from South Bend, Indiana, is going to win critical swing states. I don't think, it doesn't seem that Amy Klobuchar or Elizabeth Warren are, gathering steam. Amy Klobuchar a little bit lately, but still she's running 4th or 5th. Against all my better instincts, I'm beginning to think seriously that Michael Bloomberg might actually be the Democrats' best hope against Trump, which is a depressing thought, because Michael Bloomberg's election would ratify the notion that the decisive factor in American politics is private money. And, while it would rescue us from the competitive authoritarianism of Donald Trump, it would hardly seem to me to be a strikingly democratic outcome and would set a terrible precedent. Somebody suggested the other day, they said, instead of Steyer and Bloomberg spending all this money to try to get elected president, why don't they at least take a couple $100 million and pay the restitution fees of all the ex-felons in Florida who are being denied the vote because they haven't paid some court fine that arose in their cases. Florida passed a law by popular vote saying ex-felons can vote, and then the Republican legislature said only if they repay this thing. And in some cases a couple $100, in some cases a couple $1,000. It wouldn't put a dent in Bloomberg's wealth and only a minor dent in Steyer's wealth to just pay all those off, and you would get 1 million extra voters in Florida, and mostly Democratic voters. But I don't know. I don't see my nightmare scenario, and it feels to me like where we're headed is that you'll get to the Democratic convention. No one will have a majority of the delegates. Bernie Sanders will have more delegates than anybody else. And in the second round, when superdelegates are allowed to vote however they want, they will vote to nominate someone other than Bernie Sanders. And the Sanders folks will say, fuck you, and sit on their hands or vote for the Green Party or whatever, and there will be a civil war in the Democratic Party. And I think that's not an improbable outcome. I'm extremely concerned about that. And just to go back, I mean, I hate to make the Nazi analogy, but I'm fascinated by the Nazi period, and these parallels keep coming up. One thing that helped Hitler consolidate power in Nazi Germany was that the Social Democratic Party and the Communist Party were at war with each other. And so the strongest left opposition forces to Hitler were at war with each other and unable to cooperate in government or after Hitler came to power in uniting to oppose him. And I see the anti-Trump forces in America like that now. They can't put aside other differences, especially big policy difference, to unite around the central political priority, which is to prevent this further consolidation of anti-democratic forces in America.
Over here.
Yes, is there any hope for the national popular vote movement?
No. You know, there's this very interesting thing where states are passing laws saying if enough states join the thing so that they represent a majority of the electoral college, to pledge that however their state voted, they will cast their electoral college votes for whoever won the popular vote. Right? California has passed this. It's pretty big. I mean, we're up to, I don't know, 200 electoral votes and something of states who have passed this thing. So let's say it passes. Let's say we get to states that represent 300 electoral votes have passed this thing, including Texas, let's say. So Trump loses the popular majority by 5 million votes, but he wins Texas by 500,000 votes. Do you really think the Texas legislature is going to instruct its electoral college delegates to vote for Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren or Joe Biden instead of who the people of Texas voted for? It would be political suicide. And the same thing would be true if Trump somehow magically won the popular vote, and California, where the Democrat had won by 3 million votes, is going to instruct its electoral delegates, its electoral college delegates, to vote for Trump in the face of this overwhelming majority for the opposite in their states. So I think there's a possibility that they'll get enough states to pass this thing to get to above 269, but I can't imagine it actually happening. It'll be a little bit like, you know, the scene in West Side Story where the social worker is trying to get the two gangs to mix, and they have this little mixer dance, and the music stops, and the Anglos are opposite the Puerto Rican, and they look at each other, and they just go like this and grab the partner that they wanted in the first place somewhere else, and then they dance. You know, I think it would be an incredible political crisis if it then happened that the Electoral College, by the old count, elected somebody, the popular vote was in the other direction, and then states were instructing their Electoral College delegates to vote against the vote in their state. Boy, I think that would be wild. It's a nice effort. I mean, the great thing about it is you don't need a constitutional amendment. But I just doubt whether you could actually do it in a deeply polarized election.
I have a question about truth.
What is truth? Didn't somebody say that once?
Fox News, I was looking at statistics that showed that people who watch Fox News have a tendency to vote differently from people who watch some of the other news things. And having looked at Fox News one time and going, oh, they're all lies. But obviously these people are watching it and not picking that up. Is there anything we can do about that?
I don't know what. I mean, it would be one thing if Fox News, I mean, Rush Limbaugh just got the Medal of Freedom, right? I used to listen to Rush Limbaugh religiously when he first got on the air, late 80s, but especially early 90s. He was on during my drive time to the university, so I would listen to Rush Limbaugh every day. And I had a long history of listening to right-wing radio. I always thought it was fascinating, even though I was appalled by it. And he was so out of it, and so marginal, and so extreme, and no Republican wanted to touch him. No Republican wanted to be associated with him. He was just this crackpot right-wing ideologue. He didn't change. If anything, he got worse and filled his broadcast with racist, homophobic, misogynist bullshit, and gradually he became respectable. And after he became respectable, he suddenly became a kingpin. You couldn't compete for the Republican presidential nomination without making an appearance on the Rush Limbaugh show and kowtowing to what a wonderful force for good in the world he was. And now he's being given the Medal of Freedom. The terrible truth about Fox News is that it's a highly successful commercial operation. It has by far the best television ratings of any of the cable networks, just beats the crap out of CNN. MSNBC has come up some. Rachel Maddow has become somewhat competitive with some of the Fox News stuff. But there again, I think the only way to break that hold of Fox News on its viewers is for them to have a catastrophic confrontation with reality. And that means an election which they think they are obviously going to win because everybody thinks this way, and they suffer a crushing defeat. But as long as they're riding high, and as long as their ratings keep going up, and as long as their revenues keep flowing in, and as long as their causes keep winning, there's no reason to imagine that Fox News or conservative talk radio is going to just fade away just because it happens to have no respect for facts or truth.
Yes, they've really raised the bar on political presidential election in the sense that you know, in order to have that much money to dominate the media and get the word out with all the different forms of media now, you have to have an unbelievable amount of money, and then also have to have the right political agenda and be allied with all the right people. And you know, it's hard to get out there and do that. And you know, I really like some of the messages that were coming across by the different politicians. You know, it was interesting that the debate between Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders, Hillary was able to, you know, just beat up Sanders pretty bad. And, you know, it just depends upon analyzing those the kind of things that she was looking at, and how the political dominoes were falling.
I personally don't think debates matter very much anymore. I don't think they're mattering in the current Democratic nomination fight. I don't think Bernie Sanders is ahead because he's been dominating the debates, and people who have had Kamala Harris got a big bump once because of the attack she made against Joe Biden that sort of gave her prominence. Other than that, you know, you look at who people think did best in the debates, and the next day the polls look the same as they did before. And I don't think the presidential debates between the Republican and Democratic nominee are going to matter that much. There's all this talk about how we have to get somebody who can stand up to Trump in the debates, or otherwise we'll lose. Hillary Clinton stood up just fine to Trump in the debates. Trump was horrible in the debates. And everybody sort of conceded he probably lost every debate, but that wasn't what was driving voters. And as for the money, I agree. And you know what? Before the money, the reason the money has become so decisive is because political campaigns got professionalized. And so you have really high-powered, very skilled technicians, specialists, scientists of election campaigns, who now know how to shape a message and a candidate to be victorious. And they don't come cheap. And the techniques they use are expensive, too. But not only does this mean that money has a hugely more important role in campaigns than it used to be, because you've got to have this huge pot of money, it also means that the discourse of political campaigns is all just bogus crap. It's all just selling soap. And so the debates don't have any very meaningful exchange of real views. Everything is focus group tested. It's a battle of propagandists. And that's true within the Democratic Party, within the Republican Party, between the Republican and Democratic Party. So we're no longer having a national conversation during elections, but we are spectators to a propaganda war between the two sides. That's not democratic either. It's not exactly competitive authoritarianism, but it means there's something fundamentally flawed about the democratic process. And increasingly, we all realize that that's what elections look like, which makes us less inclined to believe that we ought to participate in them. And so participation rates go down and the like. I mean, I think modern democracy is in a terrific crisis, not just here, but as you were mentioning, all around the world. And I don't see trends that are moving in the direction of somehow resuscitating it. As for the money, there's a dual thing now, because it means that billionaires can run and never have to drop out because they have endless money. It means that people who appeal to billionaires can be prominent and never have to drop out because the billionaires will keep writing checks, and then they're beholden to these billionaires in some ways. But there's a third way. The internet has enabled people like Bernie Sanders, Ron Paul before him, Obama, for that matter, until he became the nominee, to raise gobs and gobs and gobs of money in small contributions over the internet. So Bernie Sanders raised $50 million the last quarter, spent it all, raised another $25 million in January without a penny coming from rich people. And so money in politics has gotten more complicated because there are several different ways that you can get this pile of money. One of the problems that Joe Biden has right now is he can't do either. He's not raising big money from billionaires, and he's not being able to raise money on the internet. And the $100 that I sent him somehow didn't put him over the top. You know? And so that's another reason why his campaign is really struggling. He's about to face Super Tuesday. He can't buy any TV time because he doesn't have any money.
Defeated Jimmy Carter. Last question, I think.
While I have lots to query about in what has been said, I have a very specific question that I hope you can provide some enlightenment about, and it has to do with Amy Klobuchar. Now, it is my understanding that when she was a prosecutor in Hennepin County, she got a conviction as an adult for a 16-year-old black teenager who she prosecuted for murder. And it has come to light that, well, and, I'm sorry, I should flesh that a little bit. Because a gunshot was shot not at anybody, but randomly, went through a house and killed a 12-year-old, no, 9-year-old, I think she was, girl. And it has come to light that this entire prosecution has been bogus. Right. And she has been touting her work that brought all these things about. So here's my question. She's not going to I don't know that she's going to back off of this, and unless she does some kind of enormous mea culpa, if she were to become the Democratic nominee, she would have to get large numbers of African Americans to support her. Do you think, with that bomb waiting in the background, which the press is not covering now because she's nobody, but if she starts winning, it'll be everywhere. Do you think that cancels her out as a meaningful possibility?
I don't know. I think it depends on how she handles it. Kamala Harris had similar problems with her prosecutorial and attorney generalship things. That wasn't what killed her, but it was an obstacle to getting African American votes. To some extent, I think African American voters could be mobilized to vote against Trump with any Democratic nominee. But their turnout in 2016 was way below what their turnout was during the Obama elections, and I don't think they would vote for Trump because of this past. But they might say, you know, here's another reason to skip this because all these white candidates basically screw blacks all the time. Paradoxically, and this may seem really cynical, but I think these issues in Kamala Harris's background and Amy Klobuchar's background outside of the African American vote could be an asset in the general election in persuading people who voted for Obama and then switched to Trump to switch back to the Democrats. That they would be seen as candidates who are not pushing racially oriented political correctness, and paradoxically and appallingly, that might actually be a political asset with some groups.